3 years ago, I went into emergency surgery. I had contracted sepsis from diverticulitis. This was a true emergency. I had to have a procedure called a Hartmann's procedure. This is where they remove part of your bowel, and this saved my life. I didn't know that word before, Hartmann's, but I know it very well now. And I remember the theatre. I remember the cold of it, the fluorescent light that has no interest in being kind. And there was a surgical team around me with the calm of people who do this every day. For them, it was a normal Friday. And for me, it was the last ordinary moment I was going to have for a long time. They put me under, and that's where the ordinary part ends. The first thing I became aware of was that I was no longer in my body. I could see the table, I could see the surgeon, I could see her team working on the figure lying between them. That figure was me. I understood that, but I wasn't in it anymore. There was no panic in that. That's the thing I want you to hear, because every instinct tells you that leaving your body should be terrifying. I didn't feel that. It wasn't terrifying for me. It was the calmest I'd felt in years. And then the theatre disappeared. What replaced it was not another physical space. And I want to be careful with the language here, because the wrong word collapses the experience into something smaller than it was. It was a different dimension, not metaphorically, but it was literally somewhere that did not operate by the rules of the physical world I had just left. It was ethereal. That's the closest word. It was like passing through a membrane into something that had always been on the other side of ordinary reality. It was always there, but it wasn't accessible from inside a body. I came into a chamber. There was no tunnel, there was no light. It was a horseshoe-shaped chamber, and seated around it were several beings with long white hair, white robes, and in their hands they were spinning spheres of light. I stood there and I thought, wow, I've died. But I didn't feel any dread with that. There was a recognition of some kind, like arriving somewhere you didn't know you'd been heading for. And then the thought that followed it, and I'm telling you this exactly as it arrived, I am home. I am home. What I felt in that space is the part I have the least language for. It was love, but not love the way the word usually works, not love directed at me from one source. It was love as a quality of the atmosphere, like being immersed in it, bathed in it, if that word doesn't sound too dramatic. But I'd never felt anything like it before. I hadn't felt it in any relationship or in any moment of my life up to that point. And all I wanted to do was stay there. It wasn't an abstract preference. It was a concrete, settled decision. Whatever I was returning to, it was going to be less than this. The life on the other side of that membrane, the cold theatre, the fluorescent lights, the body on the table. Then I heard something. Now, I didn't hear it through my ears because I didn't have a sense of having ears. It was through something else. It was directly into whatever I was in that space. There were two words that were said 3 times that echoed in my mind. And the 2 words were, not yet, not yet, not yet. Because I wanted to stay. I made that clear. Then there was a voice close to my face. It was a woman's voice trying to bring me back. I thought she was an angel. And I want to say that plainly, not poetically. That was a genuine confusion I had. The distance between where I'd just been and where I now was, that recovery room, that fluorescent light, that face leaning over me, the distance was not yet fully crossed in my mind. She was a nurse. She was doing her job, and she was very good at it. But for a few moments, I could not locate myself in the physical world well enough to know that. That's where the story begins, not in the chamber, but in the recovery room, in the strange, slow process of returning to a life I had seen from outside. What I found when I looked at it from that distance is what this audio is about. I'd been tolerating a health issue for some time, which was acid reflux. And I tolerated it for longer than made sense. But it wasn't only acid reflux, it was my body making noise about something that needed attention. And I had developed a reliable system for not attending to it. You have to remember that when symptoms arise, this is nature's way of telling you something needs to be addressed, something needs to be changed. But because I developed a reliable system for not attending to it, that was one thing the distance showed me. The other things were harder. My mom had died. And then 3 months later, my brother was killed in a bicycle accident. I was his best man a few months before he died. You carry grief like that differently to how you carry ordinary loss. I can tell you it doesn't sit in one place. It moves around. It shows up in what you're willing to see and what you'd rather not. And boy, I was carrying a lot of it. And I was functioning, because functioning is what you do when you don't know what else to do with it. The surgical table that I lay on stopped me functioning. And in that stopping, something became visible that the functioning had been covering. You see, the life I'd built was fit for the person I'd been before all of that. Before the losses, before the body started signaling, it was built for someone who still had the luxury of treating time as though it were unlimited. But it didn't fit anymore. I just hadn't had the vantage point to see it clearly until I was outside looking in. The surgery left me with a colostomy bag. I did have a reversal, which came 18 months later. But those 18 months, let me tell you, was not a spiritual retreat. I want to be clear about that. I experienced leaks publicly. They were messy. There was the constant low-level fear of being in public, of embarrassment, of the wrong moment. My confidence, which I'd always taken for granted, went somewhere I couldn't locate. So I stopped going out unless I really had to. I became really skilled at being a hermit. In that enforced stillness, I started talking. I started talking into a microphone to nobody at first, but to whoever might eventually listen. That's how this started. It wasn't from a strategy, but it was from a man sitting indoors who was not confident enough to walk to the shops without fear, and deciding that having a voice was still possible even if everything else felt unreliable. The channel came from the confinement, not despite it, but through it. And I tell you this because the mechanism is one I now recognize everywhere. The structure that finally shifts is almost never the one you plan to change. Most people leave a life that no longer fits, and it's not because they lack the intelligence to see the problem. They can see it, all right. But most people are perfectly capable of diagnosing their own situation, but they stay because the structure they built was genuinely theirs once. It was a good fit. It reflected something real about who they were when they made the decisions that produced this life. And there's a loyalty to that. There's a loyalty to a past self, to work that costs something to build. This is not stupidity. It's a form of integrity. Is it misplaced? Yes. Is it real? Yes. James Hollis, the Jungian analyst, makes a distinction that I keep returning to. He says most people are not afraid of change. They're afraid of loss. And every genuine transition requires losing something without a guarantee that something better arrives to replace it. Now, that's a different ask to self-improvement, because self-improvement will promise you a return. I can tell you that genuine transition doesn't. What the table gave me was the removal of choice. The sepsis didn't ask, hey, are you ready? Didn't ask whether I was ready or not. Forced transitions are brutal. They are also, in my experience, more honest than the ones we keep postponing. They remove the option of waiting until you feel ready, because you never feel ready. That's not a personal failure. That's how transitions work. Now, there's a story running underneath all of this that doesn't get examined enough. It says persistence is moral, commitment is character, changing direction is suspect. If you leave something you've built, you need a reason good enough to satisfy other people's standards. Illness qualifies, bereavement qualifies, sepsis qualifies, but quiet dissatisfaction? The slow private knowledge that this life is yours in name, but not in feeling? The sense that you've outgrown the structure without a catastrophe to point to? That doesn't usually pass the test. So people wait. They wait for a catastrophe clear enough to justify the exit. And more often than not, the catastrophe comes. That's the part that troubles me most. The body speaks when the mind won't. The marriage ends when the person couldn't leave. The job collapses when the resignation stayed unwritten for a year. The structure finds its own way to end the arrangement when the person inside it can't bring themselves to. The table was my catastrophe. I didn't choose it, but I did choose what to do with what I saw from it and what I heard before I came back. This pattern is not only personal, it's running at scale right now. Whole categories of inherited structure no longer fit the people living inside them. Career paths designed for a world that has fundamentally shifted. Relationship models built on economic arrangements that no longer hold. And institutional loyalties that ask people to perform a commitment the institution stopped earning years ago. And the collective response is almost identical to the individual one. Stay. Justify the staying. Wait for something catastrophic enough to make the exit feel legitimate. The psychologist Dan McAdams has spent decades researching how people construct the narrative of their own lives. And what he finds is that people who navigate transitions well share one specific capacity. They can hold two stories simultaneously. The story of who they were, honored and not erased, and the story of who they're becoming, uncertain and not yet fully formed. Now, people who get stuck tend to insist on one story or the other. So either I'll make this work because it was always mine, or I've wasted everything and I can't recover. Both are ways of refusing the gap between what's ended and what hasn't arrived. Now, that gap, that structureless middle, I spent 18 months inside it. I know what it costs. I also know what it produces, especially if you don't try to collapse it too quickly. But here's what doesn't get said enough about recognizing that a life no longer fits. The recognition doesn't make it easier. It makes it harder, much harder, because you can't unknow it. When you identify things, when you name things, it requires a response, and the response is rarely clean or immediate or accompanied by a clear sense of what comes next. The finitude question, the one I couldn't avoid after being on that table, is the sharpest version of this. Most people know abstractly that they're going to die. It's known, but it's uncertain. The table, for me, made it concrete. And not yet means there is a yet, which means there is a when. Concrete finitude changes what you're willing to tolerate. It changes what patience looks like. It changes which losses feel acceptable and which ones are simply time being spent in the wrong direction. My brother was alive on the morning he died. He had no idea it was his last one. I was his best man a few months before that morning. Neither of us knew what was coming. That is not a comfort, but it is a piece of information I carry every day about what a day is worth. The grief and the courage arrive together. I can't resolve that into something neater. That's just what was true. So here's what this means practically. You did not fail the structure. You simply became someone the structure wasn't built for. You've grown past something that was genuinely yours once. The structure served you. Honor that. But then ask honestly, is it still mine? Not, is it good enough? Not, it could be worse. But is it still genuinely mine? The moral question isn't whether staying in something you've outgrown is wrong. Sometimes it is right for a season. The question is whether you can be honest about the reason. Choosing to stay is different from waiting for permission to leave. Only one of those is a decision, and only one of those keeps you oriented. And the capacity you can build, the practical thing, it's the ability to tolerate the gap. This is the middle period between what no longer fits and what hasn't arrived yet. Most people try to collapse it. Most people try to rebuild something too quickly or jump to certainty because the uncertainty feels like failure. It isn't. The gap is where you find out who you are when the structure isn't telling you. I know that from the inside. 2 words said 3 times sent me back into a life I then had to honestly look at. The microphone was how I started looking. Before you move on from this, I have a question for you. Where in your life have you been waiting for a catastrophe to give you permission to change something you already know needs changing? Not for me, but for you, privately, before the next thing starts.